Imagine owning the most fashionable living creature in England, a small, cloud-white dog wrapped in dense fur, pressed against silk cushions, breathing poison with every single breath. London's wealthiest families did this every morning without a second thought. Their Pomeranians were not just companions, they were architecture, they were status, they were proof that you had arrived. And the real scandal was not that these animals suffered in silence. The real scandal was that an entire industry made certain nobody asked why. For 3 decades, breeders, coal merchants, and the fashionable press built fortunes while thousands of animals deteriorated in city drawing rooms. As the evidence mounted, as veterinarians raised quiet alarms, as the dogs themselves showed every symptom of slow poisoning, the response from those who profited was not concern, it was silence. This is the story of the Pomeranian in Victorian England, not the fairy tale of royal elegance and drawing room charm, but the darker truth buried beneath the smoke. London, 1850. Step outside any morning, and the city does not begin with sunlight. It begins with smoke. Coal smoke from 10,000 chimneys merges with the Thames fog to create something that has no name, yet a yellow-brown curtain that turns noon into twilight, that stings the eyes from 50 paces, that deposits a fine black film on every surface it touches. Londoners call it the particular. Scientists will one day call it smog. In 1850, most people simply call it London. In this city of 2.5 million souls, somewhere between the factory districts of Southwark and the grand stucco terraces of Belgravia, a very specific animal has become the defining symbol of upper-class life. Small enough to carry, dense enough to suggest luxury, white enough to demonstrate that you could keep something clean in this relentlessly filthy city, the Pomeranian. To own one in 1850 was to make a statement. To own several was to announce your position in the social order as clearly as any title. These small, extravagant dogs had become the living currency of Victorian prestige, bought, displayed, admired, and replaced with a frequency that nobody thought to question. The morning ritual in a wealthy London household began before the family woke. The servants lit the fires first. Coal fires in every fireplace, in every room, because the alternative was cold, and cold was for the poor. 6 fireplaces burning for 2 hours before Lady Catherine Ashford descended to the breakfast room at 9. The air indoors was warm, but it carried something else, a thin particulate haze, barely visible, that accumulated on curtains and settled into furniture and quietly collected inside lungs. Human lungs adapted, more or less. People coughed. They cleared their throats. They developed the persistent London cough that visitors from the countryside noted immediately upon arriving in the city. The Pomeranians could not adapt. Their coats' dense double layers, designed for the punishing Baltic winters of their ancestors along the southern shore of the Baltic Sea, trapped particulates like a filter. Their faces, increasingly compact as breeders selected for smaller, more decorative features, reduced their airway capacity with every generation. Their small bodies processed toxins with far less reserve than larger working breeds, and they spent their entire lives indoors, confined to the most smoke-concentrated domestic environments in human history. A Pomeranian, kept in a wealthy London home in 1850, breathed what we would today measure as air quality roughly equivalent to smoking 35 to 40 cigarettes a day. The exposure was continuous, from the first fire of morning to the last ember of night, every single day of their short lives. Nobody measured it then. Nobody was asking the question. But here is the question that no one raised in polite society. Why were these animals so prized in a city that was systematically destroying them? The official answer was simple: fashion, breeding prestige, aristocratic association. The Pomeranian descended from large working sled dogs in the coastal Pomerania region of northern Europe, dogs built for snow and open air and hard labor. By the time they reached England, through German and Dutch trading connections in the 18th century, selective breeding had already begun. reducing them from 30-pound working animals into decorative ornaments weighing under 10 pounds. Smaller was better. Wider was better. More compact was better. More fragile, paradoxically, was also better. It suggested refinement. The kennel records documented it. The fashionable magazines celebrated it. The aristocracy repeated it as truth. But the real answer to why these animals were sold in such quantities into London's poisoned air was not found in drawing rooms or breed standards. It was found in the economics of industrial England, in the coal yards and breeder accounts, in the structural incentives of an industry that had discovered a perfect product. An animal so fashionable that its early death created the demand for its replacement. Britain in 1850 burned more coal than the rest of the world combined, 49 million tons per year. Every house, every factory, every locomotive, every steamship, the entire machinery of the empire ran on coal. And coal, burned at the concentrations that a city of London's density produced, created an atmosphere unlike anything humanity had ever lived inside before. The monthly death records from the London Bills of Mortality showed patterns that should have alarmed anyone who looked carefully. Respiratory deaths spiked every winter. They clustered in the densest neighborhoods. They fell disproportionately on the very old, the very young. And though no one was systematically recording this on animals kept indoors beside coal fires, the Pomeranian breeding industry had expanded explosively through the 1840s, where once only a handful of aristocratic families maintained these dogs. The rising middle class now wanted them too. Factory owners, successful merchants, solicitors, anyone who had money and wished to demonstrate it needed a Pomeranian. A well-bred specimen cost between 8 and 25 pounds sterling at mid-century. To contextualize that figure, a skilled factory worker earned 12 pounds a year. Breeders competed on coat color, body size, and the density of the ruff around the neck. The whiter the dog, the higher the price. The more compact the form, the greater the prestige. But nobody competed on health metrics. No breeder tracked lifespan systematically. No kennel club published survival rates. No study was commissioned to compare the longevity of city-kept dogs with country-kept specimens of the same breed. Because the numbers, had anyone gathered them, would have been devastating for business. The testimonies are there for anyone who searches the Victorian archives carefully. They are precise in their details and relentless in their repetition. A letter from Elizabeth Hartwell, London, 1853. My Pomeranian Marco was purchased at 8 weeks of age for 16 pounds from a Kensington breeder of considerable reputation. He was a perfect specimen, white, compact, full of spirit. By his second year, he had developed a cough that never fully cleared. By his third year, he required near-constant veterinary attention for what our doctor described as congestion of the respiratory passages. He died at 4 years of age. I was informed this was typical for the breed in city conditions. I have since come to understand it was not typical at all. It was preventable. An entry from the records of the Royal Veterinary College, 1856. Patient, Pomeranian female, age 3 years. Resident of Belgravia. Presenting complaint, persistent respiratory distress, markedly reduced exercise tolerance, intermittent hemorrhaging from the airways. Condition consistent with chronic inhalation injury from particulate exposure. Prognosis poor. Note, this is the 17th similar presentation from the Belgravia and Mayfair districts in the current calendar year alone. A report filed by the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals, 1858. Inspector Thomas Reed, Westminster District. In the course of 4 household visits this quarter, I observed Pomeranian dogs in states of advanced respiratory illness. In each case, the animals were confined to rooms with active coal fires for a minimum of 16 hours daily. The owners were uniformly unaware that coal combustion products might be injurious to small companion animals. Several, upon being informed, expressed considerable distress. Others questioned whether our concern was warranted by any scientific authority. Between 1845 and 1865, the average recorded lifespan of a city-kept Pomeranian in London was somewhere between 3 and 5 years. Their counterparts kept on country estates, in households that burned less coal, and where the dogs had access to outdoor air, regularly lived to 12 or 14 years. The difference was not genetic. It was not constitutional weakness of the breed. It was the air they breathed, in the rooms where their owners kept them, in the city that had made those owners wealthy. But breeders never published these comparisons. Kennel clubs never investigated the disparity. Fashionable magazines never asked why so many beloved pets died young and required such frequent replacement. Because there was too much money in selling the replacements. When a Pomeranian died after 3 or 4 years, its owner did not typically blame the coal industry or the breeder or the conditions of urban life. They blamed the breed. Delicate creatures, people said, prone to respiratory weakness, sensitive to the English climate. This fragility was almost considered part of their charm. These beautiful, ephemeral animals that required constant care and fairly regular replacement. The language of delicacy served everyone in the supply chain. The breeders understood the economics of it with perfect clarity. A dog that died at 4 years meant a new sale in year 5. A dog that lived to 14 meant no transaction for a decade. The financial incentive to never investigate the mortality question was enormous, and the breeding industry behaved accordingly. The kennel clubs of the 1850s were social institutions as much as regulatory ones. Their membership overlapped substantially with the breeding community itself, or with the aristocratic buyers who patronized it. To formally investigate Pomeranian mortality in London would have meant investigating the conditions maintained by their own clients and colleagues. To publish findings would have meant acknowledging that city life was fundamentally incompatible with the animal being sold into it at considerable profit. The veterinary journals of the period are revealing in precisely what they do not contain. Individual practitioners documented respiratory disease in small companion breeds with notable and increasing frequency. Case reports appeared in the Veterinarian and in the Proceedings of the Royal College, but no systematic study was ever commissioned. No public advisory was ever issued. No breeder was ever required to disclose to a buyer, "This animal may not survive London air." The coal interests, meanwhile, had stakes that extended far beyond the health of fashionable dogs. Any suggestion that coal smoke caused harm to animals, to people, to any living thing was a direct threat to the economic foundation of the entire Victorian project. When reformers raised concerns about urban air quality in the early 1850s, the response from industrial interests was swift and carefully calibrated. Coal smoke, argued one prominent industrialist in an 1851 parliamentary committee hearing, is the breath of prosperity. Those who propose to eliminate it propose to eliminate British commerce itself. The newspapers, dependent on advertising from coal merchants, from heating appliance manufacturers, from fashionable shops that sold expensive breeds, these papers did not publish the veterinary reports. They published breed profiles. They published tips for maintaining the whiteness of a Pomeranian's coat in a smoky city. They published advertisements for the newest litters from the most prestigious London kennels. Nobody told the buyers the truth about what they were bringing home. The shift in understanding did not begin with a dog. It began with a methodology. In 1854, a physician named John Snow had already published his landmark work linking cholera to contaminated water in the Soho outbreak, demonstrating against fierce institutional resistance that disease followed environmental patterns invisible to naked assumption. His methods, systematic case documentation, geographic mapping, statistical cross-reference, had begun to reshape how a new generation of investigators thought about urban illness. A younger colleague, Dr. Arthur Pemberton of St. Bartholomew's Hospital, applied similar thinking to a question that had unsettled him for several years. His wealthier patients in the West End were dying of respiratory disease at rates he could not explain through individual constitution or hereditary weakness. Their domestic servants, who lived in the same houses but spent more time near doors and windows, consistently fared somewhat better. Their relatives from the countryside, who came to visit and almost invariably developed coughs within weeks, recovered reliably upon returning home. In 1857, Pemberton published a detailed analysis in The Lancet. He had collected mortality and morbidity records from 340 households across 6 London districts. He had cross-referenced household coal consumption with the incidence of respiratory illness. He had documented, with statistical precision, that urban coal smoke was not merely unpleasant, it was measurably and demonstrably lethal to those who breathed it in concentrated form over sustained periods. His report addressed human health primarily, but in a footnote that would prove significant, Pemberton noted his own clinical observation: that small companion animals, particularly those with dense coats and increasingly compressed facial anatomy, appeared to develop respiratory disease at rates dramatically exceeding those of comparable animals kept in cleaner air. He named the Pomeranian by breed. He suggested the pattern deserved systematic investigation. The press covered the report briefly. The Times ran 4 paragraphs. The Illustrated London News ran 3. And then the coal industry responded, and the serious coverage largely stopped. The response from industrial and breeding interests followed a pattern that was by then thoroughly rehearsed. First, the methodology was attacked. Pemberton's sample was too small, argued a letter signed by 14 industrialists and published prominently in the Times. His data collection had been irregular across districts. His conclusions dramatically exceeded what his evidence could support. He was a young physician, dangerously overreaching his expertise and his authority. Then the implications were reframed. Even if urban air was suboptimal, the word chosen with care, it was the price of civilization itself. London had not become the greatest city the world had ever produced by protecting the lungs of drawing-room ornaments. Then Pemberton himself became the target. His professional associations were scrutinized. A rumor circulated in club rooms that he had financial interests in an alternative fuel enterprise. It was untrue. It needed only to create sufficient doubt to delay action, and it accomplished that with considerable efficiency. The Smoke Nuisance Abatement Act of 1853 had already passed, nominally requiring factories to consume their own combustion products. In practice, it was largely unenforced. Penalties were trivial. Inspectors were few. Prosecutions were rare enough to be meaningless as deterrent. For the Pomeranians, nothing changed. When women involved in the emerging animal welfare movement raised concerns, citing documented evidence of companion animal suffering in urban coal smoke environments, their arguments were dismissed with a familiar weapon. Sentimental, said the critics, hysterical, an excess of feminine sympathy misapplied to the grave necessities of economic life. It was the same word, deployed in the same manner, for the same purpose, to prevent inconvenient truths from unsettling profitable arrangements. The industries that sold coal and the industries that sold dogs had found a common interest in silence, and silence was what they maintained. The transformation, when it came, was not the consequence of moral awakening. By the late 1860s, 2 forces converged to shift the situation. The first was the accumulating weight of evidence that could no longer be entirely dismissed. The mortality data from London's periodic severe smog events had grown too large to ignore, even in parliamentary committees. The Public Health Act of 1875 would eventually give legal structure to what reformers had argued for a generation. But for the Pomeranians specifically, the change arrived from a different direction and from motives that had nothing to do with the welfare of the animals involved. As the breed's popularity spread through the 1860s from the aristocracy into the broader middle class, It followed the familiar trajectory of Victorian fashion. Once a symbol of genuine exclusivity became widely accessible, those who had used it to signal their position moved on. The Pomeranian was becoming common. And common was, in the vocabulary of Victorian status, a kind of social death. The fashionable drawing rooms of the late 1860s and 1870s were shifting toward different breeds: Italian greyhounds for some households, Maltese for others. The Pomeranian's peak moment of London fashion was passing. As the premium urban market declined, breeders who pivoted toward country and estate clients discovered, to nobody's genuine surprise, that their animals lived dramatically longer. Country air, they began to advertise, suited the natural constitution of the breed. Pomeranians flourished away from city conditions. Not one of them acknowledged what the records of the Royal Veterinary College and the SPCA inspection reports had documented for decades: that city air had been killing the animals they sold into it, and that they had known, or could have known, and had chosen consistently not to ask. The true history of the Pomeranian in Victorian London is not a story about dogs. It is a story about how industries manage inconvenient knowledge, about how the people who profit from a harmful system construct the silence around it, not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary and entirely rational self-interest of everyone who benefits from not asking the dangerous question. The breeders were not monsters. They were business people operating within a system that rewarded them handsomely for not knowing what they could have known. The kennel clubs were not villains. They were institutions whose membership had direct financial interests in a particular answer to the mortality question. The newspapers were not corrupt in any dramatic sense. They were dependent on advertising from the very industries their journalism would have threatened. The silence was not coordinated. It was structural, and structural silence, as any historian of industrial harm eventually understands, is far more durable than the conspiratorial kind. Conspiracies can be exposed. Structures simply continue. And the animals at the center of it, those small, white dogs bred from working creatures of the Baltic coast, transported into the most polluted urban environment in the world, and confined to coal-heated rooms for the entirety of their shortened lives, had no voice in any part of it. They could not testify to parliamentary committees. They could not publish letters in the Lancet. They could not organize societies, or write petitions, or refuse the conditions imposed upon them. They could only cough and grow sick and die young and be replaced. Between 1,840 and 1,880, thousands of Pomeranians lived and died in London drawing rooms, their lives shortened by a decade or more by the air their owners breathed without consequence. The industry that supplied them knew, or could have known, and chose not to look. The institutions meant to protect animals found other priorities. And when the breed eventually fell out of fashion and the breeders moved on, nobody issued a reckoning. The fashionable magazines that had celebrated these dogs for 30 years simply began celebrating something else. The smoke continued. The city continued. The industry found new animals to sell into the same conditions. This is the real history of the Pomeranian in Victorian England, not a charming footnote in the story of royal pets and drawing room refinement, but a precise and uncomfortable demonstration of how economic systems distribute the cost of their own damage into the bodies of those who cannot speak, and then call it natural, call it constitutional weakness, call it simply the way things are. Fashion, like any industry, answers only one question: what can we sell, and at whose expense?